What if the most important thing in your life is also the thing you understand the least? You live inside your mind every second. It chooses what you notice, what you fear, what you want, what you remember, who you trust, what you love, what you laugh at, and what you call reality. And yet, for most people, the mind still feels like a blur from the inside. Immediate, intimate, powerful, but strangely hard to describe. That is exactly why Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works matters. It is an ambitious attempt to explain what the mind is, where it came from, and why it produces the specific kinds of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors we call human. If you care about your own growth, and you want more expert summaries from some of the world's most influential authors, take a moment to like, share, and comment on this video, because that support is what keeps this kind of serious, deeply useful work going. Pinker came to this book after The Language Instinct. And that matters because How the Mind Works is not just another popular science title. It is a widening of the lens. Pinker, an experimental psychologist whose work spans visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations, wanted to do for the rest of the mind what he had already done for language: show that what feels effortless and natural is often the result of extraordinary hidden design. But he does not begin with arrogant. One of the most important things to understand about the book is that it starts from humility. Pinker later made clear that we still do not fully know how the mind works, especially when it comes to common sense and scientific inference. His point is not that the mystery is over. His point is that many things once treated as miracles are finally becoming problems science can seriously work on. And if you are the kind of person who would rather see clearly than stay comfortable, type "I choose clarity" in the comments, because that is the spirit this book demands from its reader. The core of Pinker's vision rests on three big ideas. First, thinking and feeling are forms of information processing. Second, the mind is not one giant undivided power, but a complicated arrangement of parts that solve different kinds of problems. Third, those parts were shaped by evolution, just as bodily organs were. In a later exchange about the book, Pinker summarized its argument in exactly that structure: computation, specialization, and evolution. That triad is the engine behind everything that follows. But what makes the book powerful is that Pinker does not present this as a dry theory. He uses it to reinterpret almost every ordinary feature of human life, from visual perception to rage, from love to jealousy, from humor to religion. Whether you agree with all of his conclusions or not, the book has a very clear mission: stop treating the mind as a fog and start treating it as a system with structure, purpose, and constraints. That is why the book opens with a brilliantly concrete question. If human intelligence is so ordinary to us, why is it so hard to build a machine that can do what an ordinary person or even a small child does without effort? Pinker begins with the robot challenge. He asks us to imagine a machine that can enter a room, identify objects, move around obstacles, interpret a request, grasp the right item, and carry out a simple task. Science fiction makes this look trivial. Real engineering reveals how staggeringly difficult it is. Pinker's point is not really about robots. It is about perspective. We admire Shakespeare, Einstein, and Mozart, yet Pinker asks us to see that the deeper marvel may be the basic human capacities we barely notice: seeing, walking, reaching, recognizing, navigating, understanding. A child carrying out a simple instruction is, in his framework, performing a miracle of hidden computation. The opening chapter is designed to make your ordinary mental life feel strange again, not to mystify it, but to make explanation possible. From there, Pinker attacks one of the laziest habits in thinking about human nature: the appeal to one grand cause. Maybe it is all culture. Maybe it is all learning. Maybe it is all self-organization. Maybe it is all the brain in some vague, undifferentiated sense. Pinker thinks these explanations fail because they flatten the problem. If a system can do many radically different things, then one generic force is probably not enough to explain them. He bolsters this with evidence that the mind has internal structure. Brain injuries can selectively remove one capacity while sparing another. One person may lose the sense of color but still perceive shape. Another may recognize objects but fail to recognize faces. Another may behave as if half the visual world no longer exists. Pinker also points to behavioral genetics, including twin evidence, not to say that experience is irrelevant, but to argue that the mind cannot be an empty surface written on from the outside. The hidden lesson of this first chapter is that human nature has architecture. The mind comes with original equipment. That opening chapter also gives you the method Pinker will use for the rest of the book, reverse engineering. Just as you can understand a machine by asking what problem it was built to solve, Pinker wants us to understand mental faculties by asking what adaptive challenges they were designed to meet. In that sense, psychology becomes a kind of engineering in reverse. He is not saying every detail of thought and behavior is a perfect adaptation. He explicitly argued against that caricature. But he is saying that design questions matter. If you want to understand why a mental system has the shape it has, you have to ask what job that shape might have helped it perform. That method is Pinker's master key. He uses it to move from black box awe to structured curiosity. The human mind, in his telling, is not magic dust sprinkled on matter. It is a set of problem-solving systems embedded in a biological organism with an evolutionary history. The second major stage of the book is thinking machines, and here Pinker asks what it even means for a mind to think. His answer is that intelligence involves representations and computations, internal states that stand for things, plus processes that transform those states in useful ways. He is careful, though, because he knows critics hear the mind is like a computer and immediately picture beige office hardware or simplistic mechanical reasoning. That is not his claim. His argument is that brains and computers can both embody intelligence for some of the same basic reasons, even if they are built from entirely different materials and work in very different ways. In later course materials, Pinker described this chapter as explaining how reasoning can be implemented in brains and computers through both classical symbolic approaches and more probabilistic, pattern-based approaches. In voiceover terms, this chapter says, the mind is not a ghost. It is not a vapor. It is an organized information processor, even if its physical implementation is uniquely biological. But Pinker does not stop at defending computation. He also defends structure. He pushes back against the idea that one general learning system could explain the totality of human cognition. In his view, the range of human thought suggests a mind with differentiated tools rather than one universal trick. That is why the same chapter also turns toward logic, connectionism, and eventually consciousness. Pinker is fascinated by how thought can be flexible without being formless. He is also disciplined enough to admit where explanation weakens. In later comments on the book, he made clear that psychology does not yet have a complete theory of how the mind achieves common sense. And, in his teaching, he described this chapter as exploring not only reasoning, but also the easy and hard problems of consciousness. That distinction matters. Pinker is much more confident explaining how information becomes globally available in a system than he is explaining why subjective experience feels like anything from the inside. So, Chapter 2 does something rare in big thinking science writing. It expands the reader's ambition and reins in the reader's certainty at the same time. Then comes one of Pinker's most memorable ideas, the human cognitive niche. In Revenge of the Nerds, he asks why our species became so radically dependent on intelligence in the first place. Why did humans not simply evolve better claws, stronger jaws, thicker skin, or sharper night vision? Pinker's answer is that humans increasingly survived by understanding cause and effect, by inventing tools, by cooperating, and by passing useful knowledge from one person to another. In a later explanation of this idea, Pinker described the cognitive niche as our way of making a living through understanding the world well enough to manipulate it, outsmarting plants, animals, and environments, not by waiting for new genes, but by using models, plans, and shared know-how in a single lifetime. That is a profound shift. It means human power comes not from escaping nature, but from occupying a different place within it. This chapter is Pinker's naturalistic account of human distinctiveness. What makes humans unusual, in his telling, is not a divine spark. It is a ratcheting combination of physical intelligence, social intelligence, and language. One lets us infer how the world works. One lets us coordinate with others. One lets us turn private discovery into cumulative culture. That last point is crucial. Pinker emphasizes that rockets, medicine, agriculture, and cities are not the products of isolated genius alone. They depend on information accumulating across generations. We live inside inherited solutions. So when Pinker explains human evolution, he is not just explaining raw brainpower. He is explaining why a species with the right mental ingredients could turn learning, teaching, bargaining, gossip, planning, and invention into a runaway feedback loop. This is why the chapter title works so well. The nerds are not weaklings who triumphed by accident. They are the beneficiaries of a strategy in nature: solve the world with brains, and then share the answers fast enough for intelligence to compound. From there, Pinker makes a strategically brilliant move. He goes to vision. The mind's eye is one of the most revealing parts of the book, because it takes an experience that feels direct and effortless, seeing, and shows that it is a massive computational achievement. He treats the visual system as a kind of open secret, one of the best understood faculties in cognitive science, and therefore the ideal place to demonstrate how explanation can work. According to a university course guide built around the book, this chapter covers stereo vision, shape from shading, frames of reference, object recognition, face recognition, mental imagery, and mental rotation. That list alone already tells you the point. Vision is not a camera. The retina gives you signals, but the mind has to infer depth, surfaces, motion, shape constancy, and identity from incomplete information. What feels like simple awareness is, underneath, a relentless process of interpretation. And Pinker uses that insight as a template. If the mind must work that hard just to give you a stable visual world, why would thought, emotion, or social judgment be simple? This is where the book becomes increasingly powerful as a worldview, rather than just a set of facts. Pinker wants you to internalize the logic of hidden mechanisms. The mind is full of achievements that feel transparent only because they work so well. Face recognition does not feel like computation, but it is. Mental imagery does not feel like engineering, but it is. The same goes for many of the capacities we call intuitive, emotional, or social. Vision is Pinker's gateway drug into a larger habit of explanation. Do not confuse effortless experience with simple design. If seeing is built from layers, then likely much of the rest of mental life is too. That takes us naturally to good ideas, where Pinker turns from perception to reasoning. Here, he challenges another flattering illusion, the fantasy that intelligence is one seamless power applicable to everything alike. Pinker does not deny rationality. Far from it. But he argues that human reasoning is not one perfect flashlight shining across every problem with equal force. In later teaching notes, he described this chapter as an exploration of logic, categorization, mathematics, probability, analogy, creativity, and genius. Another course guide, built around the book, highlights categorization, stereotypes, infant categorization, folk theories, metaphor, and intuitive understanding of domains like psychology and biology. Put simply, Pinker's question is this: what kind of reason did nature actually build? And what are its strengths and blind spots? Pinker begins with categorization because thinking would be impossible without it. The mind must sort the world into kinds. It must learn what counts as the same, what predicts what, which resemblance matters, and when a category is useful or misleading. But once you see categorization as a core mental activity, you also begin to understand why human thought can go right and wrong in very human ways. We generalize. We compress. We infer. We use folk theories. We carry intuitive models of physics, biology, psychology, and social life that are often effective in ordinary contexts, but can mislead us when reality becomes statistical, abstract, or modern. Pinker is deeply interested in that mismatch. The human mind can be gifted at practical inference, yet stubbornly awkward at formal probability. It can be sharp in analogy and metaphor, while sloppy in explicit logic. One of the deepest lessons of this chapter is that reason is real, but reason is shaped. It evolved in an ecology. It has a profile. If you can already feel that idea changing how you view your own thoughts, this is the right moment for the second micro-commitment. Type "I see the pattern" in the comments if you are starting to notice how often what feels like immediate truth may actually be old mental machinery doing fast, useful, imperfect work. And that brings us perfectly into hotheads, because Pinker now turns to the part of the mind people most often imagine as the enemy of reason: emotion. The old story says reason is noble, emotion is chaos, and maturity means putting the second under the thumb of the first. Pinker argues that this story is not just oversimplified. It is wrong at the design level. In Pinker's account, emotions are not bugs in the system. They are control states. They help the mind set priorities when goals collide. Any organism faces multiple demands at once: avoid danger, seek food, defend status, protect offspring, maintain alliances, find mates, preserve long-term plans. You cannot maximize all of them simultaneously. Emotions solve that problem by reorganizing attention, memory, urgency, and action around a specific kind of challenge. According to the course overview of the book, this chapter ranges across the neurological foundations of emotion and topics including beauty, disgust, fear, happiness, impatience toward future rewards, selfishness, guilt, gratitude, sympathy, romantic love, and self-deception. Pinker's thesis, summarized in that guide, is that emotions are well-engineered systems that work with intellect and are indispensable to the mind as a whole. That is a radical reframing. It means rage, fear, desire, attachment, and disgust are not simply eruptions from below. They are strategic responses with logic. That does not mean Pinker romanticizes emotion. Quite the opposite. One of the most uncomfortable strengths of this chapter is that it explains why emotions can be socially costly, personally painful, and still make design sense. An emotion can look irrational from a detached perspective and still be locally useful for the types of conflicts organisms repeatedly encounter. Fear can overfire because the cost of one missed danger may exceed the cost of many false alarms. Jealousy can be destructive and still understandable within a system shaped by reproductive stakes. Romantic love can look ridiculous and still function like an investment strategy that coordinates attention, loyalty, sacrifice, and obsession. In Pinker's framework, the mind is not split into a wise self and a primitive animal. It is a federation of systems with different priorities and time horizons. That idea alone can change the way you interpret your own behavior. You stop asking, "Why am I so irrational?" and start asking, "What system is taking command right now? And what problem does it think it is solving?" Then, Pinker goes where many readers wanted him to stop, into family, sex, loyalty, beauty, betrayal, rivalry, status, and war. Family Values is probably the book's most provocative chapter because it applies the same mental engineering framework to social relations. According to the public course overview built around the chapter, Pinker covers arranged marriage, altruism toward kin, parent-child conflict, sibling rivalry, the evolution of sex, human mating systems, male-female differences in sexual behavior, the role of appearance in mate selection, status, friendship, and war. The key idea is not that human relationships are fake or cynical. It is that they are structured by mixed motives because different people's interests overlap only partly. Kin are allies, but not perfectly. Lovers are partners, but not perfectly. Friends are cooperative, but not perfectly. Social life is not a soft cloud of pure feeling. It is a landscape of cooperation, shot through with friction. Pinker begins with kinship because it reveals the logic most clearly. Why does altruism run so strongly toward family? Why do parents sacrifice so much for children? Why can siblings be loving and rivalrous at the same time? Pinker draws on evolutionary thinking about shared genetic interests and conflict within families. Parents and offspring both have reasons to invest in one another, but they are not selected to want exactly the same distribution of care, risk, and resources. Siblings are bound by family connection, yet still compete. That is why family life can contain so much devotion and so much tension without being morally incoherent. The chapter then moves into mating, where Pinker argues that sex, attractiveness, jealousy, and differences in reproductive pressures shape predictable patterns in courtship and conflict. Even people who dislike these arguments have to reckon with Pinker's ambition here. He is trying to explain not only love, but also why love so often travels with insecurity, bargaining, possessiveness, fantasy, and pain. The chapter goes even wider. Pinker treats status, friendship, and coalition building as central features of human psychology, rather than superficial add-ons. Humans monitor favors, debts, loyalty, reputation, and rank, because these things affect safety, influence, mates, and resources. We care who is dependable, who can mobilize allies, who can shame us, who can help us, and who might betray us. That is why friendship matters so much, and why status stings so deeply. This is also why war appears here, because once minds are built to track coalitions, inside-outside boundaries, honor, retaliation, and group competition, large-scale conflict becomes tragically intelligible. Whether or not you buy every adaptation Pinker proposes, this is where the book earns its reputation for boldness. He does not retreat into vagueness when the topic becomes emotionally loaded. He insists that the same mind that sees and reasons also competes, bonds, strategizes, and fights. And if this summary has already helped you connect psychological theory to real life, send it to one person who loves big ideas, and leave your own take below, because thoughtful communities are built one shared insight at a time. After all that, Pinker reaches the chapter with the most audacious title of all, The Meaning of Life. This is where many books would drift into vague inspiration. Pinker does the opposite. He asks a sharp question. If minds were shaped by survival, reproduction, kinship, and practical problem-solving, why do humans spend so much time making art, telling stories, joking, listening to music, practicing religion, and doing philosophy? The course overview for the book puts the question bluntly: how do we explain humans' interest in art, music, storytelling, religion, and humor? Pinker's answer is not one-size-fits-all. Sometimes, he treats these higher pursuits as byproducts. Sometimes as technologies built on older mental systems. Sometimes as social displays. And sometimes as ways the mind turns its own tools back on itself. What matters is that he refuses the easy split between the low functions of survival and the high functions of meaning. For Pinker, the higher life is still produced by the same evolved mind. Take art and story. Pinker is interested in why certain landscapes, forms, and patterns grip us, and why stories feel indispensable even when they do not feed us or shelter us. One way to summarize his approach is this: the arts may work not because they descend from a single sacred instinct, but because they press on many systems at once: perception, emotion, status, social simulation, memory, and pattern. Stories, in particular, can function like low-cost rehearsals for human life. They let us simulate danger, motive, betrayal, love, loss, triumph, and moral conflict without paying the full cost of living every scenario ourselves. Humor fits the same general style of explanation. It exploits expectation, ambiguity, surprise, and social awareness. Laughter may feel spontaneous, but Pinker wants you to see structure underneath even that. The point is not to flatten beauty into utility. The point is to explain why beauty and utility are not strangers in the first place. Music is where Pinker became especially famous, and for many readers, especially controversial. Public discussion of the book has repeatedly highlighted his claim that music may be better understood as a pleasurable byproduct of older mental systems than as a direct adaptation in its own right. Later coverage of Pinker's view summarized it this way: music, on his account, works by drawing on faculties for sound, pattern, and emotion, rather than necessarily existing as a separate instinct with its own uniquely selected biological function. You do not need to agree with that claim to understand why it matters. It captures Pinker's willingness to say that some of our most treasured experiences may not be direct evolutionary targets at all. In the Boston Review exchange over the book, Pinker explicitly emphasized that after 7 chapters of reverse engineering the mind's major parts, he would conclude by arguing that some of the activities we regard as most profound are non-adaptive byproducts. That is not reductionism in the lazy sense. It is an attempt to widen the menu of explanation beyond everything important must be a direct adaptation. Religion and philosophy bring the book to its most vertiginous edge. Pinker is fascinated by why supernatural ideas can feel natural and why the mind persistently reaches toward ultimate explanation. He does not treat religion as proof that science has failed, but as evidence that human beings possess mental systems deeply concerned with agency, cause, order, membership, morality, and the interpretation of events. Philosophy then becomes the moment when the mind turns back on itself and asks what any explanation ultimately means. This connects back to one of the most important tonal features of the whole book. Pinker does not claim that every deep question has been solved. He repeatedly distinguishes genuine scientific progress from total closure. His aim is not to eliminate wonder, but to redirect wonder away from foggy mystification and toward the actual design of human mental life. The mind becomes more astonishing, not less, when its complexity starts to come into focus. So, what is the fullest summary of how the mind works? It is Pinker's attempt to show that the mind is neither a blank slate waiting for culture to write on it, nor a single all-purpose beam of intelligence. It is an evolved, structured, many-sided system. Perception is active inference, not passive recording. Reason is powerful, but specialized, not smooth and universal. Emotion is strategic and indispensable, not simply the opposite of thought. Social life is built from kinship, conflict, cooperation, status, desire, and reciprocity, rather than pure sentiment alone. And the higher pursuits of art, humor, religion, music, and philosophy emerge from that same mind, sometimes as direct functional systems, sometimes as layered products of older capacities. Pinker's achievement is not that he closes the file on human nature. It is that he gives you a way to ask smarter questions about it. To read Pinker well, though, is not to kneel before every conclusion as settled fact. Public debate around the book made that clear from the start. Critics argued that he sometimes extended adaptationist explanation too far or moved too quickly from plausible evolutionary logic to confident functional claims. Pinker answered that criticism by emphasizing that the book lays out criteria for evaluating adaptive hypotheses, and that not everything in the mind should be treated as an adaptation. That tension matters because it tells you what kind of book this really is. It is not a list of neutral laboratory results. It is a grand synthesis, powerful, controversial, and deeply generative. Some specific claims may age, be revised, or remain contested. But the book's central habit of mind remains potent. Look for hidden structure. Ask what problem a system solves, and do not confuse familiarity with simplicity. And maybe that is the greatest gift of how the mind works. It changes the altitude of the questions you ask. After Pinker, Why Do People Do That? Becomes less about slogans and moral melodrama, and more about mechanisms, priorities, trade-offs, and design. You begin to notice that what feels spontaneous may be highly structured, that what feels irrational may be locally useful in a context you have not considered, and that what feels uniquely personal may be shaped by ancient systems shared across humanity. If this summary gave you something real, support it with a like, a share, and a comment, because that is how we keep building a serious library of ideas for people who want more than empty motivation. And hold on to the final lesson of the book. Understanding the machinery does not destroy the miracle. It lets you see the miracle without illusion. Keep thinking with that. Keep watching yourself with more honesty. And keep going, because once you start noticing how the mind works, you can't really go back to sleep inside it. See you in the next summary.